dangling by a single numbing hand over a pit of human remains. Marla Jenkins watched her last flashlight flicker toward extinction. Below her lay a sea of white bone, the missing people of Blackwood. And above her stood Miller, the only man she ever trusted, his boot inches from her bleeding fingers. As the cavern floor groaned and began to swallow them both, a distorted voice crackled through her radio, clear and impossible. It was her father, dead for 10 years, whispering the same 3 words that had driven him to his grave. The debt is paid. Marla's fingers slipped an inch, the jagged limestone tearing into her palm. She didn't care about the career-ending lawsuit or the developers waiting at the surface. She only cared about the thermal camera clutched in her other hand, which showed a pulsing heat signature coming from the solid stone wall. Something alive, something massive, and something that the town of Blackwood had been feeding for generations. Miller leaned down, his face a mask of grief and madness, and whispered, "It's not a cave, Marla. It's a mouth." The cave air clung to Marla Jenkins's skin like wet wool, thick with the stench of damp stone and something older. Rot, maybe, or the slow decay of things that never saw the sun. She stood waist-deep in the freezing runoff of Blackwood Cave, her boots submerged in a current that felt like liquid needles pressing against her calves. The acoustic monitor in her hands hummed with a fragile, electronic life, its screen flickering as she struggled to calibrate the sensors. Every breath was a labor, the crushing humidity of the Appalachian deep wrapping around her lungs until each gasp felt like swallowing warm silt. She wiped a smear of mud from the monitor's dial, her fingers twitching with a frantic, systematic energy. This wasn't just fieldwork. It was a desperate attempt to capture the invisible pulse of the mountain before the world outside decided to bury it in concrete and greed. A heavy boot scuffed against rock behind her, the sound echoing through the cavern like a gunshot. Marla didn't turn, her focus anchored on the oscillating waves of the acoustic display. "If you're here to tell me the permit's expired, Silas, save it," she muttered, her voice rasping against the limestone walls. "I've got 3 more readings before the tide cuts off the entrance." Silas didn't answer with words. Instead, the toe of his work boot connected with a tripod leg standing on a slick ledge. The metal groaned, and Marla's stomach dropped as she lunged, her fingers closing around the base just as the second kick sent the equipment skidding toward the dark abyss of a lower fissure. Silas exhaled through his nose, a sound like a bull readying for a charge, his massive frame swallowing the dim glow of her headlamp. He stood there, a silhouette of local malice, his hands the size of dinner plates flexing at his sides. He wanted her gone, wanted the data destroyed, and wanted the silence of the mountain to remain undisturbed by the prying eyes of a scientist who knew too much. As she pulled the tripod back from the edge, a familiar, gnawing heat bloomed in her chest. The guilt that had become her constant companion since her father, Daniel Jenkins, had vanished. He had died in these same mountains, under the employ of the very land development firm now pushing Marla to the brink. She remembered the way he used to look at the earth, as if the soil held a secret language he was just on the verge of translating. Now, every drop of freezing water that hit her neck felt like his hand, a cold reminder of the questions left unanswered and the body never found. She wasn't just here for the bats or the habitat survey. She was here because the guilt of not digging deeper 10 years ago was a weight heavier than the mountain itself. She couldn't save him then, but she could protect the truth now. With a defiant jerk of her chin, Marla reached into her pack and pulled out the infrared cameras. She began to mount them along the jagged walls with an aggressive, rhythmic precision. Each bolt driven into the limestone felt like a middle finger to the developers waiting in their glass towers in Charleston. She was documenting a sanctuary, a hidden world of rare species that the law would have to protect, even if the town wouldn't. The infrared lenses stared out into the dark like unblinking eyes, ready to catch the heat signatures of the life the developers claimed didn't exist. She moved with a predator's caution, her breath shallow, her eyes darting to every shadow Silas cast. She was a professional, a woman who had traded her wild auburn mane for a practical crop because she couldn't stand the way it tangled in her fingers when she was nervous. Now, her fingers only moved to secure the evidence. A beam of light cut through the gloom from the direction of the entrance, and the heavy, rhythmic tread of someone who knew these tunnels better than their own living room announced Miller's arrival. The grizzled park ranger stepped into the chamber, his khaki uniform stained with the same damp earth that covered Marla. He looked like a man built of cedar and granite, his face a map of every trail in the Appalachians. Miller didn't say much, but he moved to the tripod, his large, calloused hands helping Marla haul the heavy gear further into the cavern. There was a quiet understanding between them, or so she thought. A shared burden of protecting a place that the rest of the world saw only as a resource to be extracted. Despite the escalating tension in the town of Blackwood, Miller remained her anchor, a guide who didn't flinch when the mountain whispered. They pushed deeper into the throat of the cave, the air growing thick and nauseating with the suffocating stench of guano. The floor became a slick, treacherous carpet of bat droppings and decayed organic matter, the scent of ammonia stinging Marla's nose until her eyes watered. They were heading for the primary nesting site, a cathedral of stone where the rare species they sought were tucked into the highest crevices. Every step was a struggle against the environment itself, the cave resisting their intrusion with narrow passages and low-hanging stalactites that clawed at their gear. Miller led the way, his lantern casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the mineral-streaked walls. The deeper they went, the more the outside world faded, replaced by the rhythmic drip of water and the heavy, humid silence of the deep earth. They reached a wide gallery where the ceiling vanished into darkness. But before Marla could deploy the next sensor, a series of splashes echoed from the passage behind them. Silas hadn't left. He'd returned with reinforcements. 2 miners, their faces smeared with coal dust and sweat, flanked him as they stepped into the light of Marla's headlamp. Their intentions were written in the way they held their heavy flashlights, not as tools, but as clubs. They stood at the entrance of the gallery, a physical blockade designed to end the survey by force. "You're done, Jenkins," Silas rumbled, his voice echoing with a flat, dead certainty. "The company doesn't want you here, and we don't want you here. Nature's a luxury we can't afford." The confrontation didn't stay verbal for long. Silas lunged, his massive hand closing around the strap of Marla's equipment bag. She didn't hesitate. She swung her heavy aluminum tripod in a wide arc, the metal connecting with Silas's ribs with a sickening thud. The brawl was brutal and desperate, fought in the mud in the dark. Marla used the tripod like a staff, fending off the first miner while Miller grappled with the second. The ground was a slurry of guano and runoff, making every footing a gamble. She felt a fist connect with her shoulder, a jolt of pain radiating down her arm. But she didn't stop. She was a woman who had spent too much time in tight spaces to be intimidated by a man who only knew how to break things. She drove the foot of the tripod into Silas's shin, forcing him back with a snarl of pain. "Miller, get the bag!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she shoved the ranger toward the deeper tunnel. She realized they couldn't win a sustained fight against 3 desperate men, but she could buy enough time to secure what they had. With one final, desperate swing that sent Silas sprawling into the freezing runoff, Marla turned and bolted into the darkness. She didn't look back to see if they were following. She navigated by instinct and the fading glow of her headlamp, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scrambled over rock falls and squeezed through narrow gaps, the sound of the miners' shouts growing distant but never truly disappearing. She was retreating, but it was a tactical withdrawal, a move to protect the data that was now her only shield. She found a small, secluded alcove and collapsed against the damp wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands shook as she reached into her jacket and pulled out the digital recorder. It had been running the entire time, tucked into her pocket to catch the high-frequency vocalizations of the bats in the upper gallery. This was it, the vital audio recording that would prove the cave was an active, protected habitat. She checked the levels, her thumb tracing the scarred line across her palm. The green lights on the display were steady. She had it. A legal silver bullet that would stop the drilling and the blasting, at least for now. She closed her eyes for a second. The silence of the alcove pressing in. The weight of the mountain feeling slightly lighter now that she held the truth in her hand. Miller appeared a few minutes later, his breathing heavy but his expression unreadable as he crouched beside her. He leaned against the stone, his eyes darting back toward the tunnel they had just fled. "We need to move soon," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "They won't stay down for long." Marla nodded, but she couldn't resist the urge to verify the integrity of the recording. She plugged in her earbuds, the wire tangling in her fingers. She needed to be sure the high-frequency chirps were clear, that the interference from the fight hadn't ruined the file. Miller stood watch, his hand resting on the hilt of his heavy belt knife, a silent guardian in the dim red glow of her backup light. She hit play. The recording started with the expected hiss of the cave's ambient noise, the drip of water, the distant rush of air. Then, the high-frequency chirps of the bats began, a rhythmic, alien staccato that filled her ears. But as she listened, the chirps began to warp. They slowed down, the pitch dropping until they dissolved into something else entirely. Marla froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. It wasn't a bat. It was a voice. A rasping, hollow whisper that sounded like it was being squeezed through a throat filled with dust. "Marla, don't come in here. It's a mouth." It was her father's voice, the same cracking, desperate tone from his final recording, whispering a warning that only she could know. The recorder slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the mud with a soft thud as the cave seemed to breathe around her. The horror of the recording was still vibrating in her ears when her satellite phone buzzed in her pocket. A jarring, electronic intrusion. She pulled it out with trembling hands, the screen's harsh blue light illuminating the grime on her face. It was a message from the development firm, a digital ultimatum delivered with the cold precision of a guillotine. Falsify the environmental report by midnight. Delete all acoustic data. If you fail to comply, we will initiate a breach of contract lawsuit. Your career is over, Jenkins. Choose wisely. The words blurred before her eyes. They weren't just asking for a lie. They were demanding she bury her father all over again. The pressure was a physical force now, a vice tightening around her skull. They knew she had found something, and they were willing to dismantle her entire life to keep it in the dark. Marla looked at the phone, then at the dark tunnel stretching ahead of her, and finally at the recorder lying in the mud. A harsh, barking laugh escaped her throat, a sound of pure, jagged defiance. "Choose wisely," she whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. She didn't turn back toward the entrance. She didn't start the long climb to the surface to find a lawyer or a way out. Instead, she grabbed her gear and pushed deeper into the limestone corridors. If they wanted a war, she would give them one. But she would fight it on her terms, in the belly of the mountain where the truth lived. She ignored the ultimatum, her mind sharpening into a single, focused point of intent. She needed more than just a voice. She needed a smoking gun that no corporate lawyer could explain away. As she moved, the cave began to fight back in ways that defied her scientific training. Her equipment, usually reliable to a fault, started to flicker and die. The sensors on her acoustic monitors spiked into the red, then flatlined, as if hit by a massive pulse of electromagnetic interference. Her headlamp dimmed, the beam yellowing and dancing with static. It felt as if the mountain itself was jamming her, a high-tech wall of noise rising from the very rock. She shook the monitor, her fingers rubbing the scar on her palm. "Come on, you piece of junk," she hissed. But the screen remained dark, leaving her with only the narrow, uncertain glow of her backup light. The isolation was no longer just physical. It was technological. She was flying blind in a labyrinth that seemed to be rearranging itself with every step. She rounded a sharp bend where the walls smoothed out into a gallery of ancient, water-worn stone, and her light caught something that stopped her heart. There, etched into the limestone in crude, dark charcoal, were drawings. They weren't ancient petroglyphs. They were frantic, modern sketches of something moving in the dark. Shadows with too many limbs, eyes that looked like cracked glass. They were identical to the drawings she had found in her father's bedside journal, the ones he had scratched out with a dying hand while the doctors talked about hallucinations and stress-induced psychosis. Seeing them here, miles underground, was a haunting confirmation. Her father hadn't been crazy. He had been a cartographer of a nightmare, and she was currently standing in the middle of his map. Desperate to see beyond the shadows, Marla pulled her thermal camera from its padded case. It was the only piece of gear still functioning, its independent power supply holding steady. She panned the lens across the chamber, the screen displaying the cold blues and purples of the surrounding rock. Then she hit a sealed side tunnel, a wall of jagged breakdown that looked like it had been there for centuries. The screen exploded into a vibrant, pulsing orange. A massive heat signature, shaped like a colossal, irregular lung, was vibrating behind the solid rock. It was too large for a colony of bats, too rhythmic for a geothermal vent. It looked like the mountain was breathing. She lowered the camera and looked with her naked eye, but there was nothing. Only the flat, dead gray of the limestone. The discrepancy made her skin prickle with a cold, primal dread. The heat signature drew her toward the squeeze passage, a narrow, vertical rift that felt like a crack in the world's ribcage. She strapped her gear tight to her body and began the slow, agonizing crawl, her shoulders scraping against the damp rock. The air here was stale, tasting of ancient dust and copper. She was halfway through, her body pinned between two slabs of unforgiving stone, when she felt a sharp, rhythmic vibration through her safety line. She looked up, her headlamp catching a flash of movement at the top of the rift. A figure in a tattered, hooded raincoat was leaning over the edge, a serrated blade glinting in the dim light. Before she could scream, the line snapped. The sudden loss of tension sent her sliding backward, her fingernails tearing as she clawed at the slick walls to stop her descent into the blackness below. The struggle that followed was a blur of claustrophobic terror. The saboteur didn't stay at the top. They dropped into the rift with an unnatural, fluid grace, pinning Marla against the rock. It was a lethal wrestling match in a space no wider than a coffin. The attacker's hands, clad in fingerless gloves, fumbled for her throat, their breath coming in thin, wheezing gasps through a stitched-shut mask. Marla fought with the desperation of the buried, her boots kicking at the rock to find purchase. She couldn't draw a full breath, the walls pressing in on her chest, her lungs burning. She managed to free her right arm, her fingers closing around the handle of her rock hammer hanging from her belt. She didn't aim. She just swung with everything she had left, the metal head connecting with the attacker's forearm with a bone-deep crunch. The saboteur let out a high, thin yelp and recoiled, the sudden movement allowing Marla to twist her body and drive her knee into their chest. She swung the hammer again, catching the edge of the hooded mask. But the attacker was already scrambling away. They didn't climb back up. They vanished into a tiny, horizontal crevice that Marla hadn't even noticed. A gap so narrow it seemed impossible for a human frame to fit through. She lunged after them, her fingers grasping at the air. But the opening was a dead end for someone her size. She was left alone in the squeeze, her pulse hammering in her ears, the silence of the cave returning like a heavy shroud. She leaned her forehead against the cold stone, her breath hitching as she realized how close she had come to never leaving that crack. Her light caught a glint of metal on the floor of the passage, tucked into a small depression where the saboteur had been pinning her. She reached down, her fingers trembling as she picked up a silver security badge. It was a standard-issue park ranger ID. The laminate scratched, but the face unmistakable. It was Miller. The man who had carried her gear, the man who had stood watch while she played the recording, her only ally in this godforsaken town. The betrayal was a physical blow, sharper than the fall or the fight. He wasn't protecting the park, he was a gatekeeper, a warden for whatever horrors the mountain held. Every piece of advice he'd given her, every shortcut he'd pointed out, it had all been a lead-up to this. She clutched the badge until the edges bit into her palm, the pain grounding her as the world shifted beneath her feet. The realization recontextualized everything. If Miller was the gatekeeper, then the town wasn't just a victim of corporate greed. It was a partner in it. She remembered the way the locals looked at her in the diner, not with hostility, but with a guarded, fearful silence. She thought of the ledger entries she'd glimpsed in the firm's digital files, the community development funds that seemed to disappear into private pockets. They weren't just mining coal. They were being paid to keep the mountain's secrets buried under a layer of silence and blood. The developers were using the town's desperation to hide something far more lucrative and far more illegal than an unpermitted mine. She wasn't just fighting a company. She was fighting a whole ecosystem of corruption that had swallowed her father whole. As if the mountain itself sensed her revelation, a low guttural rumble began to vibrate through the stone. It wasn't the sound of a drill or a tremor. It was the sound of water. A massive, subterranean surge. A sudden flash flood, triggered by a storm on the surface or a deliberate release from the mining dams, roared through the limestone corridors. The violent force of the water hit Marla like a freight train, sweeping her off her feet and tumbling her through the dark. She was a leaf in a storm, her body slammed against jagged outcroppings, the freezing water filling her mouth and lungs. She felt the world spin, the light of her headlamp dancing wildly before it was extinguished by a brutal impact against a rock wall. She was being dragged down, deeper into the uncharted lower gallery, where the air was a memory and the dark was absolute. The water eventually deposited her on a slick, sloping shelf of rock, leaving her gasping and shivering in a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight. Her primary flashlight had shattered in the tumble, the glass shards crunching under her palm as she tried to push herself up. She was lost in the absolute bottom of the cave, a place where the maps ended and the silence began. She checked her watch, the glowing dial the only thing visible in the void. Midnight had passed. The deadline was gone. In the world above, her reputation was currently being dismantled, her professional standing erased by a well-timed press release and a flurry of legal filings. She had lost everything: her career, her gear, her ally. But as she sat there in the dark, The fear began to burn away, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. If she was already a ghost, she might as well haunt the men who killed her. She fumbled for her emergency backup light, the small, rugged device clicking on with a dim, red glow. The light was weak, barely reaching 5 feet, but it was enough to reveal the nightmare she had landed in. She was in a hidden chamber, the walls lined not with mineral deposits, but with bone. The red light glinted off the smooth curves of human skulls, the hollow sockets staring back at her from every corner. There were dozens of them, skeletal remains piled in macabre heaps, some still wearing the tattered remains of work clothes or hiking gear. This was the source of the town's missing persons list. This was the illegal burial site the firm was paying to keep hidden. The cave wasn't just a mouth. It was a stomach, and it was full of the people who had tried to speak. Marla moved through the ossuary, her boots clicking against bone, her heart a drum in the silence. She reached a pile near the center of the chamber, her light catching a glint of gold amidst the white. She reached down, her fingers brushing aside a ribcage to reveal a heavy signet ring, the crest of the Geological Society worn smooth by time. It was her father's. The closure she had sought for 10 years hit her with the force of a physical blow, a wave of grief so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. He hadn't just disappeared. He had been discarded here like trash. The accident had been a murder, and the mountain had been his tomb. She slipped the ring onto her thumb, her grip tightening around her rock hammer. This was no longer a mission for Data. It was a quest for justice, written in the blood of the man who had taught her to love the earth. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice came from the shadows, calm and conversational. Miller stepped into the red light, his ranger hat tilted low, his iron pry bar held loosely at his side. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who had just finished a long day of work. The mountain doesn't like secrets, Marla. It likes to keep them, but it doesn't like when people try to take them away. He moved with a slow, predatory grace, his eyes flat and colorless in the dim light. He explained it then, the twisted logic of the gatekeeper. The Jenkins bloodline, with their prying eyes and their maps, had always been the required sacrifice to keep the mountain quiet and the town fed. He spoke of ritual and economic stability as if they were the same thing, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed off the skulls of his victims. The attack was sudden and brutal. Miller swung the iron pry bar in a wide, horizontal arc that would have shattered Marla's skull if she hadn't dropped to the floor. The metal whistled over her head, sparking against the limestone wall. She scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the bone-littered floor as Miller lunged again. He was stronger than he looked, his wiry frame fueled by a fanatical devotion to the mountain. Marla narrowly dodged a vertical strike that cracked the rock beside her hip. She was trapped in the ossuary, her back against a wall of skulls, her only weapon a small rock hammer against a 3-foot bar of iron. Every movement was a gamble, the uneven floor of the chamber threatening to trip her with every step. Desperation sharpened her instincts. As Miller raised the pry bar for a finishing blow, Marla reached down and grabbed a heavy human femur from the pile beside her. She didn't think. She just swung the improvised club with all the fury of her 10-year grief. The bone connected with Miller's temple with a hollow, sickening crack. The strike didn't kill him, but it dazed him, his eyes glazing over as he stumbled back. Marla didn't wait for him to recover. She drove her shoulder into his chest, breaking his grip on the pry bar and sending them both tumbling toward the center of the chamber. They grappled in the dark, a tangle of limbs and teeth amidst the remains of the dead. Their struggle punctuated by the groans of a mountain that was finally tired of holding its breath. The cavern floor began to groan. a deep, tectonic sound that vibrated in Marla's marrow. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the failure of the ancient limestone crust. The false floor of the ossuary, thinned by centuries of erosion and the weight of the dead, began to spiderweb with cracks. Miller, sensing the danger, tried to scramble away, but his boots found no purchase on the shifting bone. Marla watched as the rock beneath him simply vanished. With a final, echoing scream that was cut short by the darkness, Miller disappeared into a bottomless abyss, the sound of his fall swallowed by the void. The chamber fell silent, the only sound the rattling of bones as the dust settled. Marla was left dangling by her fingertips from a jagged ledge, her legs swinging over the same pit that had claimed Miller. Her emergency light was failing, the red glow flickering like a dying heartbeat. She fought against the crushing exhaustion, her muscles screaming as she tried to pull her weight back onto the stable shelf of rock. The silence of the ossuary was absolute now, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against her chest. She was alone in a graveyard, her light dying, her path out blocked by a flood, and her enemies waiting for her in the world above. She pulled herself up, inch by agonizing inch, until she collapsed on the cold stone, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She was alive, but she was buried. A secondary tremor shook the cave, more violent than the first, and a new sound joined the darkness, a wet, sizzling hiss. From the cracks in the ceiling, a thick, toxic industrial sludge began to leak, the acidic runoff from the mining operation above. It pooled on the floor, the acrid scent of chemicals burning Marla's throat. She realized then that the developers weren't just mining. They were using the cave as a pressure valve for their toxic waste. The sludge was rising, a lethal black tide that threatened to drown her in the very dark she had feared. She reached the absolute bottom of her resolve, her body shivering from the freezing cold, her mind reeling from the emotional weight of her father's tomb. She almost let go. She almost closed her eyes and let the black water take her. But in that moment of total despair, a memory surfaced, not of a voice, but of a lesson. Her father's voice, clear and analytical, explaining the concept of acoustic resonance. Everything has a frequency, Marla. Even the mountain. If you find the right note, you can move the world. She looked at the walls of the chamber, her scientific mind clicking back into gear through the haze of trauma. The limestone here was thin, weakened by the same erosion that had created the false floor. If she could trigger a controlled vibration, she might be able to shatter the vein and find a chimney to the surface. It was a desperate, 1-in-a-million shot, but it was the only thing she had left. She stood up, her feet splashing in the rising sludge, and began to hum. She started low, a guttural vibration that she felt in her teeth, then began to slide the pitch upward. She searched for the resonance, the point where the air in the chamber began to push back. When she found it, she screamed. A piercing, sustained frequency that tore through her throat and echoed off the bones of the dead. The vibration built, a physical force that made the very air shimmer. With a sound like a thunderclap, a vertical vein of limestone in the far wall shattered, the rock crumbling away to reveal a narrow, jagged chimney that angled sharply upward. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the opening, her fingers clawing at the sharp rock as she began the ascent. It was a journey through physical agony, every gain measured in inches and blood. The chimney was so narrow, she had to exhale to move, the jagged edges tearing at her clothes and skin. But with every foot she climbed, the weight of the blood debt seemed to lift. She was purging the legacy of silence, climbing out of her father's tomb and into her own life. The air began to change, the stale scent of decay replaced by the crisp, thin smell of the mountain night. She climbed until her fingers were raw and her muscles were numb, driven by a fury that burned brighter than any light. She emerged from a hidden crevice on the mountain ridge just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the Appalachians. She collapsed onto the damp grass, her body a map of bruises and cuts, her breath hitching as she looked at the sun. She was battered, bloodied, and legally a ghost, but she was alive. She reached into her jacket and pulled out her satellite uplink, the one piece of gear that had survived the climb. Her fingers moved with a cold, surgical precision as she dialed in the coordinates of the ossuary and attached the audio file of her father's voice. She sent it to the FBI field office in Charleston and the national press simultaneously. The "Choose Wisely" message was still on her screen. She deleted it. As she waited for the transmission to clear, a final realization settled over her. The spirits and the whispers she had heard, they hadn't been ghosts. Her scientific mind, finally free from the fog of fear, identified the cause. Infrasound. The unique shape of the cave, combined with the wind and the mining vibrations, created low-frequency sound waves that induced hallucinations and a sense of dread in the human brain. The developers hadn't just used thugs, they had used the mountain itself to drive people mad and keep them away from their crimes. It was a rational, scientific explanation for a nightmare, and it made the truth even more chilling. The sound of helicopters began to thrum in the distance, a mechanical pulse that grew louder as tactical vehicles began to wind their way up the mountain road. Marla watched from the ridge as federal agents swarmed the mining site and the firm's local offices. She saw the executives being led out in handcuffs, their expensive suits a stark contrast to the mud-stained reality of the mountain. The conspiracy was collapsing, the silence finally broken by the weight of the evidence she had dragged out of the dark. She stood on the ridge, her father's signet ring catching the light, and felt the weight of 10 years finally fall away. She built a small campfire on the ridge, the flames licking at the pages of her father's secret journals. She watched the charcoal drawings and the frantic notes turn to ash, the smoke rising into the clear mountain air. She didn't need the papers anymore. She had the truth, and the truth was enough. She stood in the silence, hearing only the natural wind across the peaks, a sound that was no longer a warning, but a sigh. The echoes of the deep earth were gone, replaced by a peace she hadn't known since she was a child. She was Marla Jenkins, a scientist who had found her way out of the dark. And for the first time in a long time, she was finally free.